Reading Appropriation Language. Module 2, Continuing Appropriations.
Module 2, Continuing Appropriations. In Module 1, we looked at the characteristics of appropriation language in regular and supplemental appropriations. In this module, we'll turn our attention to the characteristics of appropriation language in continuing appropriations. Continuing appropriations are a slightly different form of current budget authority. Recall from Module 1 that current budget authority is authority made available by Congress for the fiscal year during which the funds are made available for obligation. For example, a fiscal year 2017 act making appropriations for fiscal year 2017 would be providing current budget authority. In order to put the continuing appropriation in its proper context, we first need to understand that the federal government is supposed to be funded through 12 regular annual standalone appropriations bills, initiated in the House of Representatives, approved by both houses, and signed by the President before October 1st. This so-called regular order doesn't happen very often. So we typically see consolidated or omnibus appropriation acts initiated in the House of Representatives, approved by both houses, and signed by the President. We discussed what both of these types of appropriations look like in Module 1. But when Congress cannot get their appropriations work done in a timely manner, they use a continuing appropriation as a fallback maneuver. They go from the House to the Senate and approved by the President. That's why you frequently hear them described as interim, stopgap, or temporary legislation. What is a continuing appropriation? It's an appropriation that provides budget authority for federal agencies to continue in operation when Congress and the President have not completed action on the regular appropriation acts by the beginning of the fiscal year. Given that the primary reason for a continuing appropriation is to temporarily provide funding until Congress can complete their work on appropriations bills, they are necessarily restrictive. That is, the funding provided is generally the minimal amount necessary to keep the government running until Congress makes final appropriations decisions. And because the legislation is meant to be temporary, has to cover a lot of appropriations, and needs to be done in a hurry, Congress uses a lot of shorthand techniques in writing it. I like to think of it as a kind of roadmap. One of these shorthand techniques is called incorporation by reference. The legal definition of incorporation by reference is the act of including a second document within another document by a reference to the second document. This act, if properly done, makes the entire second document a part of the main document. This is a common drafting practice used in continuing appropriation language in order to save time and space. As we look at the elements of a continuing appropriation, we will see examples of incorporation by reference. But first, let's review the basic elements of regular and supplemental appropriations that were covered in Module 1 to see if they appear in continuing appropriation language. We learned in Module 1 that the Dictionary Act requires that both the regular and supplemental appropriations have a title, and the continuing appropriation is no exception. Note the slight change in wording, making continuing appropriations. In Module 1, we also learned that the Dictionary Act requires that acts of Congress have enacting clauses with a particular wording, and because both regular and supplemental appropriations are acts of Congress, they have an enacting clause. But here we find a slight difference with a continuing appropriation. It can be either an act or a joint resolution. Joint resolutions are typically used when Congress needs to pass legislation to solve a limited or temporary problem. For this reason, most continuing appropriations are in the form of a joint resolution. But joint resolutions do not have an enacting clause. Rather, they have a resolving clause. Note the wording of the resolving clause codified at 1 U.S.C. 102. Resolved by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States in Congress assembled. But this is a minor difference. In the end, it really doesn't matter whether a continuing appropriation is in the form of a resolution and follows the resolving clause requirement, or an act and follows the enactment clause requirement. Both result in the same outcome. Both become law after passage and signature by the President. But since most continuing appropriations have been in the form of a joint resolution, such legislation is usually referred to as a continuing resolution, or CR. So from here on, we'll refer to continuing appropriations as CRs. All the appropriation types we've discussed use a statement of appropriations. The CR version's basically the same as the regular appropriation version, with a couple of minor differences. The addition of the word hereby to the phrase, "The following sums are hereby appropriated," and the added phrase, "and out of applicable corporate or other revenues, receipts, and funds for the several departments, agencies, corporations, and other organizational units of government." This additional language suggests that a CR continues some authorities, like revolving funds, for example, that are not funded out of the general fund, that is, out of any money in the Treasury. We also learned in Module 1 that the default availability of funds in regular and supplemental appropriations is 1 year. The same goes for CRs. The titles include the same 4 fiscal year language as regular appropriations. To further emphasize the default availability of 1 year, note also that the CR tells us we are under the same conditions and extent and manner as the previous appropriation, including this familiar provision concerning availability. But once we get through the title, the enacting or resolving clause, the statement of appropriations, and default availability, we find the similarities end. For example, there are no unnumbered paragraphs in a continuing appropriation. In fact, there are no titles, headings, or subheadings. We go straight from the statement of appropriations into the general provisions. Remember from Module 1 that we need to answer 5 basic questions when we read appropriation language. Who's receiving the appropriation? What's it for? How much is being appropriated? How long is it available? What conditions are there on the use of the appropriations? So we will need to get answers to these by a close review of these CR general provisions. Recall from Module 1 that general provisions can be positive by permitting you to do certain things, negative by prohibiting you from doing certain things, or neither. We'll see examples of all of these in the general provisions that make up a CR. There are 5 basic components to the general provisions. We'll go over them quickly, and then we'll spend a bit of time on each. These components help us answer our questions. First of all, you need to know the scope or coverage of the CR. That is, who is receiving the appropriation. Second, you need to know the funding rate, or how much is being appropriated. Third, you need to know the duration. How long is the appropriation available? Fourth, you need to know what the purposes and restrictions are, or what the appropriation is for and what conditions are applicable. Fifth, you need some fund accounting guidance to help you figure out how to record operations under the CR. The temporary nature of a continuing appropriation makes it necessary to provide such guidance. And while these are the basic building blocks for all CRs, like pop beads for a necklace, you will inevitably have exceptions to these basic components that need to be spelled out. These are referred to as anomalies. Anomalies typically deviate from the general provisions of the CR and frequently pertain to individual accounts. Let's take a look at each component in more detail. Component number 1, scope or coverage. Who gets the funding? Recall from Module 1 that a regular appropriation is designed and structured in a way that helps to identify who gets the funding. Appropriation Act titles and statements of appropriations identify the appropriation subcommittees. Roman numeral titles identify federal agencies. Headings identify bureaus. And subheadings identify appropriation account names. However, since a CR is by design intended to provide funding to several, if not all, federal agencies, these tools are not in play. A CR needs a shorthand version, a roadmap, to fill this role. Section 101 fulfills this need. Let's see how it works in this sample language from a fiscal year 2015 CR. Section 101 lists projects or activities that were conducted in fiscal year 2014 and for which appropriations were made in a list of different acts. It's important to note that in this Section 101 context, the term projects or activities refers to appropriation accounts, not individual programs. In 2014, HHS appropriations were made in the Agriculture or Ag Bill, the Interior Bill, and the Labor H Bill. Congress is using this language in Section 101 as a shorthand way to say, if you receive funds in the previous year in one of these acts, you receive funds in this CR. Using this shorthand, they don't have to worry about titles, headings, subheadings, and unnumbered paragraphs in this legislation. These are incorporated by reference from a previous appropriation act. But how much is appropriated? This brings up component number 2, funding rate. Let's take another look at Section 101. We know from Module 1 that regular and supplemental appropriation acts predominantly appropriate specific sums of money. As a general rule, CRs do not appropriate specific dollar amounts. They appropriate such amounts as may be necessary at a rate for operations as provided in the applicable Appropriations Acts for the previous fiscal year. Don't confuse this such amounts as may be necessary language with the such sums language we saw in Module 1. In Module 1, the language denoted an indefinite appropriation, that is, an appropriation with an unspecified amount. In a CR, this such amounts as may be necessary language refers to amounts, called rate for operations, appropriated in applicable Appropriations Acts for the previous fiscal year. These amounts are incorporated by reference by this language in Section 101. Again, Congress is using a shorthand way to say, this legislation provides the same amount of money you received in the previous year. Now, of course, the amount you received in the previous year may have been a composite amount made up of appropriations, supplementals, rescissions, and sequestered amounts. In addition, in some years, Congress reduces this amount by an across-the-board percentage in order to keep the total appropriated within an agreed-upon cap. This means that you will have to examine documents other than the CR itself, documents that have been incorporated by reference to calculate these amounts. But Section 101 provides funding only for discretionary appropriation accounts. What about appropriated entitlements like Medicaid? Such programs typically need more money to cover claims than the previous year's level would provide. In order to cover such increases, the CR provides a separate Section 111 to cover these programs. Note that the funds for entitlements and other mandatory payments are provided at a rate to maintain program levels under current law. If, for example, the entitled populations grew, you might not have enough funding to pay their benefits based on the previous year amount. So looking at the previous year's appropriation for these accounts would not be particularly helpful. You would need to find out the latest estimates, probably those published in the mid-session review of the current year's budget. Taken together, Sections 101 and 111 help answer the basic question, how much is being appropriated? Building block number 3, duration. We know that a CR is designed to be temporary. The duration section tells us how long we have to spend the money provided in the CR. There are 3 options. Until enactment of a law providing funding for the accounts funded under the CR, until enactment of a law that does not provide funding for an account funded under the CR, or until a specific date. If the date in number 3 is reached and no funding has been provided, Congress would need to amend the date to allow more time. Many CR extensions are simply one-pagers that amend this section. Here is an example that simply extended the FY 2015 CR by 2 days by amending the date in the duration provision. An important point to remember, funds appropriated by a CR end on the date provided. They do not carry over even if appropriated to a multi or no year account. There's another complication in a CR. Even though we need to be aware of the duration of the CR in Section 106, we also need to consider the period of availability that needs to be assigned for accounting purposes. This period of availability, or POA, will become important when the CR becomes a full year appropriation. How do we determine this POA? That's done in building block number 4. Purpose and restrictions. The purpose and restrictions building block establishes the rules we have to follow in spending the funds appropriated by the CR. It's made up of 6 basic sections: authority and conditions, extent and manner, a prohibition on new starts, a prohibition of high initial rates of obligation, a requirement to operate under the most limited funding action, and a flexibility to avoid furloughs. Let's take a look at these provisions. Section 101, Authority and Conditions language, refers to the requirement that we are under the same authorities and conditions we had to follow in the previous year. Any earmark restrictions, any general provisions prohibiting funding for abortion, and so on. When Congress refers to a previous year's authority and conditions, this is another example of incorporation by reference. This language answers our basic purpose question. What's the appropriation for? Again, the answer can only be determined by examining the previous year's appropriation language. Section 103, Extent and Manner language, incorporates restrictions from prior year's appropriations acts, or in some cases, acts currently under consideration. GAO opinions on extent and manner typically refer to fiscal matters like period of availability and account structure. For example, as we discussed earlier, one could read extent and manner language as requiring that funds appropriated under the CR have the same period of availability and account structure as their predecessor account in the new fiscal year. If the funds were multi-year in the previous year, they're multi-year in the current year. If they were no year, they remain no year. We also know that conditions established in a previous year continue. The requirement that all funds are annual, unless specifically stated otherwise, would be such a condition. Most contemporary interpretations of CR language tend to look at authority, conditions, and extent and manner together when determining what one can do under a CR. But wait a second. When we talked about duration, we said the funds appropriated by a CR end on the date provided. They do not carry over, even if appropriated to a multi or no year account. And now I'm telling you that they get the same period of availability as their predecessor account? How do we reconcile this? Well, it's important to remember that a CR is intended to be temporary. We want the funds appropriated by a CR to be accounted for in a Treasury account that has the same period of availability as the previous year. This maintains the consistency of accounting from year to year. Yes, all funds would theoretically dry up when a CR ends, irrespective of period of availability. But the intent is to keep extending the CR until a full year appropriation is enacted. Because of the temporary nature of the CR, what appears to be counterintuitive turns out to be the most consistent reading of the language. When the full year appropriation finally happens, you want the accounting to be as seamless as possible. This Section 104 language is referred to as the no new starts language. It tells us we cannot start any new programs while we're under a temporary funding scenario. This seems logical. Under a CR, we are basically treading water until Congress decides how to fund everybody. It only makes sense you would not start a brand new program during that time. It's important to note, however, that the language only prohibits new starts for projects and activities that were unfunded in the previous year. If an agency had authority and sufficient funds to carry out a particular program in the preceding year, that program is not a new project or activity under a CR. regardless of whether it was actually operating in the preceding year. This language is targeted to programs that were authorized after the last Appropriations Act. I should point out that the expression project or activity in the no new starts context refers to individual programs rather than a total appropriation. Earlier in Section 101, project or activity referred to the appropriation account. This just illustrates how the term project or activity is contextual in a CR. Following the CR theme to hold down spending as much as possible, Congress provides language in Section 109 to prevent high initial rates of operation that would impinge on final funding prerogatives. And in Section 110 tells us to take the most limited funding action in implementing the CRs. This is especially important in those cases where the House and Senate differ substantially in providing for a particular program, perhaps even zeroing it out. This language is the primary reason why OMB has such strict rules for automatic apportionment of funds under a CR. The furlough language in Section 112 permits OMB flexibility in apportioning available funds to avoid furloughs. Note that there are very strict rules in its application. It can't be used until the agency has taken all necessary actions to reduce administrative expenses. Block number 5, the rules on fund execution and accounting. There are 3 fairly standard boilerplate sections that tell us how to execute and account for our funding under a CR. There's a section that ensures CR obligations are covered. There is a section that ensures the final appropriation structure shall be used from October 1st onward, the so-called ephemeral clause. And there is a section waiving apportionment due dates. Let's take a look at these sections. Section 105 tells us that appropriations made in the CR cover all the obligations or expenditures incurred for a project or activity during the CR. This can be very important because if Congress appropriated less in a full year appropriation than you were authorized to spend under the CR, this section could be cited to seek an additional warrant from Treasury to cover those obligations. For example, in fiscal year 2012, Congress appropriated less for a LIHEAP earmark than was obligated during the CR, and Treasury warranted the difference under this Section 105 authority. Section 107 provides accounting guidance. This section has been referred to as the ephemeral clause because of the temporary nature of the transactions recorded under a CR. Note the language. Expenditures shall be charged to the applicable appropriation fund or authorization whenever a bill in which such applicable appropriation fund or authorization is contained is enacted into law. This means that whenever a full year appropriation is enacted, all expenditures get charged to the applicable appropriation in the final bill. In other words, you act as if that appropriation was around since the beginning of the fiscal year, and all funds are charged as if it started on October 1st. It's as if the CR had never happened. This language is necessary because there's a general rule of statutory construction that in the absence of explicit language to the contrary, a statute is effective on or after the date of enactment. Without this language, the appropriations made could not be applied retroactively. This section makes it clear that the statute is effective retroactively. But this can be problematic. It was particularly significant in fiscal year 2012 when HRSA, SAMHSA, and CDC all had major account structure changes in the new appropriations actions, but had operated under an old structure under the CR, which lasted most of the first quarter. All obligations recorded going back to October 1st had to be reversed and charged to the new structure. The last fund accounting section waives the apportionment submission requirements required by the Anti-Deficiency Act. But notice that it very carefully points out that this does not mean apportionments are not required. Typically, OMB issues blanket apportionment authority in a bulletin and allows agencies to submit written apportionments under certain circumstances. We have discussed the 5 basic building blocks of a continuing resolution: scope or coverage, funding rate, duration, purpose and restrictions, and fund execution and accounting. We've seen that many of these building blocks can be looked at as pieces of a jigsaw puzzle or pop beads in a necklace that get put together year after year with minor variations. But in any given year, there will always be exceptions, otherwise known as anomalies. While the basic building blocks vary very little from year to year, the anomalies can vary greatly depending on the circumstances at the time. These may be exceptions to purpose, amount, and duration. Let's take a look at some examples of anomalies. Pay particular attention whenever you see the word notwithstanding. Notwithstanding means in spite of the fact that, and language that begins with notwithstanding is expressly overriding an existing provision of law. The word notwithstanding is frequently a tip-off that an anomaly will follow. In this example from the FY 2013 CR, notwithstanding language provides more funding to the Refugee and Entrant Assistance Program than would have been provided by Section 101, that is, the previous fiscal year's level. Note the notwithstanding Section 101 language. This anomaly overrides the amount provided by Section 101. In these examples from the FY 2015 CR, there were anomalies for the Refugee and Entrance Assistance Program, allowing OMB to apportion funds early in the fiscal year to cover an influx of unaccompanied minors. Additional funds for the Public Health and Social Services Emergency Fund and CDC for Ebola. Notice the wording of sections 136 and 137. Notice the Ebola funding was actually appropriated like a regular supplemental, using in addition to and there is appropriated to remain available until September 30th, 2015 language. Since this language meets the requirements of a supplemental appropriation, even though it appears in a continuing resolution, this means these funds continue to be available after the CR ends. This illustrates that CR anomalies are sometimes used as a vehicle for supplemental appropriations. Going back in time, anomalies have also been used for such things as preventing funds from being spent to finance combat activities during the Vietnam conflict in 1974, and preventing the use of funds to perform abortions. There is, as you can see, a great deal of variety in anomalies. So, This represents the normal structure of a continuing resolution: coverage, funding rate, duration, purpose and restrictions, fund execution and accounting, and anomalies. And we've seen samples of the type of language you may encounter. But so far, we've only discussed CRs as temporary appropriations. On occasion, they have been used as a vehicle for full year appropriations. Since the Budget Act of 1974 was implemented, there have been 15 full year continuing resolutions. The most recent years being fiscal years 2007, 2011, and 2013. While the structure is similar, there are a few language differences that occur in full year CRs. Keep in mind that a full year CR is no longer temporary legislation. If you get a full year CR, the appropriations process is essentially over for that year. Sometimes, but not always, Congress will provide a little help. They'll provide a title to let you know they have passed a full year continuing appropriation. An obvious change is in the duration section. Notice in this example the date changed from November 17, 2006 to September 30, 2007. Because temporary CRs do not need to appropriate advance appropriations, these need to be added to full year CRs. Advance appropriations appropriate funds in the current year for the subsequent year. This is needed for entitlement programs like Medicaid, family support, and foster care that need to make awards on October 1st. Remember that a full year CR is new legislation, not an amendment of a temporary CR. So any anomalies in temporary CRs that needed to be continued would have to be restated in the full year CR. It's therefore critical that all the language we have discussed is read carefully and all anomalies are applied carefully. Let's wrap up by summarizing and comparing how we answer our 5 basic questions concerning appropriations. First, who's receiving the appropriation? Recall that if the Appropriation Act is standalone, the Appropriation Act title and Statement of Appropriations will typically identify the Appropriations Subcommittee. The Roman numeral titles identify the federal agency or group of agencies. The heading identifies the bureau or optive within the federal agency. And the subheading identifies the account name. And of course, Treasury assigns a symbol for the account name. With a CR, we do not have this information. Rather, we're given a roadmap to find it by referring to the previous year, incorporated by reference, which has all of the identifying information listed above. Question 2, what's the appropriation for? In regular and supplemental appropriations, the purpose statement is typically the prepositional phrase that leads off the appropriating language in the unnumbered paragraph, with such words as for carrying out, or for necessary expenses, or for making payments, and so forth. To find the purpose in a CR, again, we have to follow our roadmap back to the appropriate reference in the previous year. Question 3, how much is being appropriated? In regular and supplemental appropriations, the amount appropriated typically follows the purpose statement. This amount is definite in most cases, but for appropriated entitlements may be indefinite. In a CR, except perhaps in anomalies, we cannot find any amounts. Section 101 tells us to look at the rate of operations of the previous year incorporated by reference for discretionary programs. And Section 111 provides rate to maintain current law for mandatory programs. Mandatory estimates are generally available in the mid-session review of the President's budget for the budget fiscal year. Question 4. How long is the appropriation available? In regular and supplemental appropriations, the default availability is 1 year, as stated in the Appropriation Act title. If Congress wants a longer period of availability, it must be expressly stated. In a CR, it's a bit more complicated. First, we need to consider the duration of the CR in Section 106. CR funding cannot extend beyond the duration date, but we also need to consider the period of availability that needs to be assigned for accounting purposes. This can be determined either from the conditions language in Section 101 or the extent and manner language in Section 103. This period of availability will become important when the CR becomes a full year appropriation. Question 5. What conditions are there on the use of the appropriations? In regular and supplemental appropriations, there are several places to look for conditions or provisos. The appropriation language itself has conditions identified by the italicized provided and provided further language. There are general provisions that apply to titles within an appropriation act. General provisions affecting HHS appropriations appear in Title VI of the Agriculture Act, Title III of the Interior Act, and Title II of the Labor, HHS, and Education Act. There are general provisions that apply to all the appropriations within an act. General provisions affecting HHS appropriations appear in the Title VII of the Agriculture Act, Title IV of the Interior Act, and Title V of the Labor, HHS, and Education Act. And there are government-wide general provisions that appear in Title VII of the Financial Services and General Government Act that apply to the entire federal government. A CR is all about conditions. Some conditions are the same as the previous year. That is, they are incorporated by reference. And we have to go back and look at all that long list of conditions from the previous year. Some are added as normal CR components, and some are added as anomalies. In modules 1 and 2, we've discussed the appropriating language of two types of current budget authority: regular, including supplemental appropriations, and continuing appropriations. In Module 3, we will discuss the language of permanent budget authority. This is budget authority that is available as the result of previously enacted legislation. As we will see, this type of language generally lacks the structure that we have seen in Modules 1 and 2.
Next up, permanent appropriations.